Hi, I'm Veronica, and this is the Reading Chronicles. For my first official video, I thought I would start with a monthly wrap-up of all the books I read in January. I read 11 books that month, and here's what I thought of them. The first book I finished was El Paciente, or Point of Balance in English, by Juan Gómez-Jurado. This was published in 2014 and has 480 pages. In this thriller, neurosurgeon David Evans is writing to the reader from his cell on death row. He's recounting how he was forced to choose between saving his daughter and killing the President of the United States. Still reeling from the death of his wife Rachel, he comes home to find his daughter Julia and her nanny missing, and he begins to receive strange messages on his cell phone that lead him to meet a Mr. White who presents him with this moral dilemma. David is scheduled to remove a tumor from the president's brain in the next 48 hours, and if he doesn't kill him during this surgery, Julia will die. With his sister-in-law Kate, who is conveniently a Secret Service agent on the First Lady's detail, he must race against the clock to save either his daughter or the president. I'm not normally a fan of thrillers, but I try them on occasion, and when I found this one in Spanish, I thought it would be a good way to continue improving my Spanish reading skills while reading a fast-paced and gripping story. The writing was fairly simplistic, so I have to give it points for that. I didn't have to look up too many words, and the plot was fairly easy to follow. We have a mastermind villain and an inherently good hero who's motivated by his love for his family. There is, however, one trope that I hate, which is that if there is a man and a woman in a story, there has to be some sort of romantic tension between them. I find that completely unnecessary, but it seems to be a common theme in a lot of the books that I read. To be fair, also a lot of the action movies that I watch. For some reason that doesn't bother me as much in movies. Maybe I can ignore it more, but when I come across it in books, it's just annoying, and I think writers can be a little bit more imaginative than that. The journey here is to ultimately find out how David ended up on death row. But there's nothing particularly new or interesting in this story. It was a perfectly decent read. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I read The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. This book was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2023, and it's 644 pages. This follows the Barnes family. Daughter Cass is on the verge of completing high school and is preoccupied with completing her exams so she can move to Dublin and go to college with her best friend Elaine. 12-year-old son PJ is being bullied by a classmate who claims his father, PJ's father, owes his mother money, and he's thinking of running away. Father Dickie's family car business is drowning, and his marriage to Imelda is on the rocks. Amid changes in a climate that brings torrential rains and flood, as well as talk of electric vehicles, each member of the Barnes family is forced to question where it all started to go wrong. Was it the bee that stung Imelda under her veil on her wedding day, which is the reason why there are no photos of the wedding in the house? Or was it a million steps along the way, a million tiny decisions that led them all to where they are now? This is exactly the kind of multi-generational family saga that I love. We go from the kids' lives back into the parents' lives to learn they are so much more than the mother and father of these struggling kids. The stories are interspersed, changing perspectives between the characters, moving quicker and quicker to the end in a sort of crescendo that ends as if the story jumped off a cliff and got stuck in midair. Some may not like the abrupt ending, but I couldn't help but laugh when it happened. I don't need everything to be all tied up in the end, and I found it surprising in a great way that Murray chose to end his story the way that he did. It's messy, and he doesn't try to tie it all up with a bow, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Next, I read Permafrost by Eva Baltasar. This was published in 2018 and is 115 pages. I heard about this triptych series on Jack Edwards' channel, and when I saw that it was originally written in Catalan, I knew it was going to be a great opportunity for me to find the translation and read them in Spanish, since Spanish and Catalan are much closer languages than English and Catalan. It was a great chance to read the story in a language that was much more similar to the one it was originally written in. The title refers to the underlayer of soil that remains frozen throughout the year, and it's a metaphor for the unnamed narrator who is fiery in her sexual attraction to women, but perpetually cool in her desire to create emotional intimacy with anyone. This is her quarter-life crisis, in which she struggles to find a job with her fine arts degree, deals with the weight of a mother obsessed with health, and a sister who embodies the idea of toxic positivity. This is less of a story with a plot, and more like scenes from the narrator's life. We see the women she's been with and left, the jobs she's taken, the memories of her sister asking her what it's like to be with women, her oppressive mother, and her emotionally absent father. The reader may not directly identify with the narrator, but some scenes will likely be relatable. Having to take on a job as an au pair because she can't find one related to her college degree. Her sister asking her to be a godmother to her new daughter, but telling her not to worry. She wouldn't want her to take on the child if anything happened to her or her husband, because she would want the child to go to a married couple, which is to say, a man and a woman. And her mother insists that she knows better for her than she does for herself. Although the narrator maintains distance from almost everyone in her life, it's her elder niece Claudia who begins to melt her frozen exterior. Recounted with poetic imagery, Permafrost is a portrait of a woman breaching the confines of sexuality, marriage, society, and family, and the cracks that begin to form in the permafrost that she has maintained around her. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read Boulder, the follow-up to Permafrost, also by Eva Baltasar, published in 2020, 80 pages, and this book was on the shortlist for the International Booker Prize in 2023. This book follows some of the themes of Permafrost. We have another unnamed narrator, but she is known as Boulder, a name given to her by her partner Samsa. Samsa says that she's like one of those big, solitary, isolated rocks at the south of Patagonia. It's really a metaphor for the solitary life that the narrator leads, which changes only when Samsa asks her to join her in Iceland. What starts as a brief stop becomes a years-long relationship, during which Samsa reveals her desire to have a child. This becomes the central conflict of the novel, as Boulder, much like the narrator in Permafrost, has never imagined herself as a mother and is actually disgusted by children. The fact that she goes along with Samsa's desire perhaps doesn't paint her in the best light, but it's a realistic portrait of someone who wants to preserve a relationship despite not wanting the same things as their partner. What's interesting is that Boulder plays what is thought to be a traditionally masculine role, but Baltasar shows that this is not exclusive to one gender. I very much identified with many of Boulder's feelings about motherhood taking over life, of society revering the pregnant person, making them into something semi-divine. The story is a brief look at a relationship between 2 people, and the relationship between a woman and a desire for love, a woman and a desire for freedom, a woman and the absence of a desire for motherhood. It felt all too real. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This was published in 2020, is 245 pages, and won the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2021. I don't normally read fantasy, but after hearing many booktubers gush about this one, I decided to give it a try. It's a winding and torturous tale. Piranesi is stuck in a labyrinth with many halls, taking note of the tides that fill them and wash away, the birds that visit them, and the sea creatures and the seaweed that he eats. He is alone save for 15 people, 13 of them dead, one he refers to as the other, and one he refers to as 16, an unknown being to whom he is writing his journals. Much of the first third of the story follows Piranesi's cataloging of the various rooms in the house, as well as his meetings with the other, during which they work on a ritual which the other believes will free the great and secret knowledge being held captive by the world. What starts as a mythical sort of walk through the labyrinth takes a sharp turn when, about a third of the way in, we get the sense that this is not the real world, even in terms of the novel, but a fantasy world in which the man who is called Piranesi is trapped. From there, the questions are, who is Piranesi? Who is the other? Why does the other warn Piranesi that 16 means to do them harm and not to talk to them for fear they will go mad? Essentially, this went from what's going on here to wait, what's going on here? I was hooked from that point. While I would have preferred an ending rooted a bit more in reality, I found the twist sufficiently surprising to make this fall tolerable. It was enough to keep even my fantasy-averse self glued to the page to find out what was really going on in these hallowed halls. I gave it 4 stars. My next read was A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 1982, and it's 183 pages. One of my projects this year is reading all of Ishiguro's novels. I used to choose an author and read their entire catalog, and that's something I haven't done for the past few years, so I'm getting back to it this year. So I won't go too much into it, I'll save that for another video, but basically this book focuses on a mother's memories of her time in Nagasaki after World War II, as her present-day self deals with the loss of her eldest daughter. As this is part of my Year of Ishiguro project, I'll be giving a more thorough look at this novel in a separate video. Next, I finished the triptych with Mamut, or Mammoth, by Eva Baltasar, published in 2022, 105 pages. This also features an unnamed narrator and also deals with the themes of motherhood, but from the other side. Here, the narrator is doing everything possible to be a mother. She goes so far as to hold what is ostensibly her 24th birthday party, but is really a fertilization party, during which she plans to sleep with one of the male guests to become pregnant. Like the protagonist of the other 2 books, the narrator is a lesbian, and for her, sleeping with these men is only a means to an end. Unfortunately, she fails to get pregnant that night, setting off a series of life changes that lead her to reject society and live in a run-down cottage of an old woman and begin to do cleaning work for the neighboring shepherd. What happens is, to me, less understandable than what happens in the previous 2 books, perhaps because, like the other 2 protagonists, I have no desire to become a mother, and for that reason I identified less with the protagonist of Mammoth. I was also unsure if I understood the end. I thought maybe my Spanish was failing me. I lacked the vocabulary to fully grip what had happened. But I looked up some summaries online and found that I had understood the words, I just didn't quite understand the sentiment. While this book deviates from the way the other 2 stories were built, it still offers an interesting portrait of a woman's experience. And it's commendable that Baltasar tried to look at both sides of the topic of motherhood. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next, I read Ain't Burned All the Bright, written by Jason Reynolds and illustrated by Jason Griffin, published in 2022, 376 pages. A, I have long wanted to read more by Jason Reynolds, and B, I've wanted to try more poetry this year, so that made this a good selection. This story is told in 3 long sentences by Reynolds and illustrated in the moleskines of Griffin. And the poem marks a bleak day in 2020, an afternoon filled with news of pandemic and protests. The narrator is in his house, his sister is on the phone, his brother is playing video games, his father is isolated and coughing in another room, and her mother is sitting with her eyes glued on the TV. The narrator wonders why the news won't change the story, and why the story won't change into something new, instead of talking about how we won't change the world, or the way we treat the world, or the way we treat each other. On the page, the lines are accompanied by images of burning buildings, smoke billowing in the air, a hellish landscape. The color red serves as a motif throughout, reminiscent of blood spilled on ground or exiting through the mouth. The image of a dark room with only light coming through a small window, the prisons that houses became. The narrator searches his house for an oxygen mask, both a literal savior and a figurative one. discovering that perhaps the mask can be found in his family. The book is a spellbinding snapshot of 2020, told through the eyes of a boy too young to fully understand the weight being borne by the world, yet too old to ignore that same world burning before his eyes. I gave it 5 stars. Next was Call Us What We Carry by Amanda Gorman, published in 2021, 238 pages. I had always meant to read Gorman's collection since it was published following her performance at Biden's inauguration, and it definitely had a different feeling reading it in January of this year. Nevertheless, I didn't realize that the majority of Gorman's collection focused on the pandemic. That's what I get for not reading the book jacket. And I didn't mean to follow one pandemic poem with another, but that's what I ended up doing. Like Reynolds, Gorman captures many feelings of the moment, such as in Fugue when she says, "Every cough seemed catastrophe, every proximate person a potential peril." She too covers the Black Lives Matter movement, likening the migration of Black people from the South to the North post-Civil War to escape from an oppressive disease built on the history of oppressed people. One of the collection's best poems is Gated. She writes, "Suddenly it struck us why it's so perturbing for privileged groups to follow restrictions of place and personhood. Doing so means for once wearing the chains their power has shackled on the rest of us. It is to surrender the one difference that has kept them separate and thus superior." The collection ends with Gorman's inauguration poem, The Hill We Climb, which remains as breathtaking as it was when I originally heard her recite it. It's a different feeling reading it now, but it serves as a necessary reminder that while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. I gave the collection 4 stars. For something completely different, I read Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton, published in 2022, 293 pages. I first found out about this book when I learned that the upcoming Bong Joon-ho movie Mickey 17 was actually based on a book. And because I like to read the book before seeing the movie, I knew I had to get this one in before the movie came out, because a new Bong Joon-ho movie is definitely a must-see. In this story, Mickey Barnes is what is known as an expendable. Having signed up to be part of a space mission to get away from some thugs whom he owes money after placing a losing bet, his job is to engage in any dangerous behavior, from environmental tests to external repairs to anything else potentially fatal that needs to be done, and to be regenerated if his physical body should perish. The reason for this space mission is part of the diaspora from Earth. After an antimatter weapon was built, war commenced and left the Earth largely uninhabitable and over half the population either dead or dying. We meet Mickey 7 as he's dropped into a hole and is left for dead by his friend and combat pilot Betho. Surprisingly, one of the local fauna, known as creepers, does not devour him alive, but picks him up and sets him outside the underground tunnels, much like a human would do to a spider found in their home. The catch is that Betho has already reported Mickey as dead, and a new Mickey 8 has come out of the tank. Now there are multiples, which is a big faux pas. Cue the antics as the Mickeys work to hide their double existence from Betho, their girlfriend Nasha, and the rest of the crew. I think the style of humor lends itself to an easy comparison to Andy Weir, but unpopular opinion, I find Weir a bit insufferable, and I fairly enjoyed the story here. It's a quick one with just enough wit for a few laughs and just enough focus on the background explanation of the characters' worlds without having to fully understand it to grasp the danger they're in. It was a refreshing sci-fi romp, and I look forward to seeing it on the big screen. I gave it 3 stars. My last book of January was All the Water in the World by Eiren Caffall, published in 2025, 291 pages. The term post-apocalyptic draws me like a moth to a literary flame, so I was excited for this new release. In the midst of a climate crisis that has caused the glaciers to melt, the oceans to rise and hypercanes to form, a group of survivors must make their way north to try to find a new land to inhabit after a storm has destroyed their previous shelter in the American Museum of Natural History, known as Amen to them. Narrated by Nora, known as Noni, the book follows her trek with her sister Beatrice, known as Bix, their father Alan, and their friend and fellow Amen keykeeper Keller, as they commandeer one of the museum's historical canoes, steer through the flooded streets and parks of New York to make their way to their aunt's farm in the Berkshires. With looks back as the world as it was, interspersed with the world as it is, Noni relates the family's relocation to the museum after the floodgates broke and the Atlantic entered the city, her mother's death due to lack of medicine for her kidney condition, the sweep of the mosquito-borne plague that took many other lives, and the other losses they've suffered. One of the things I really enjoyed about the novel was Caffall's careful attention to diversity. She is quick to acknowledge that race would make a difference in a world falling apart at the seams, and Keller being a black man is a potential danger, as people have divided along color lines and not many mixed groups are found, nor are white groups likely to trust a black man. Although it is not explicitly stated, Noni exhibits traits that may be associated with neurodiversity, saying that her brain wasn't wired like the others, that she could organize things and remember all the animals in the museum, and didn't always understand how her parents or her sister felt. Bix is potentially trans or non-binary, and that is also not stated outright. These ideas are not fully explored because they are merely aspects of their characters. They are not plots or hurdles for them to overcome. However, if there's one plot device that I'm starting to tire of in post-apocalyptic novels, it's skip ahead about 10 seconds if you don't want this miniature spoiler. It's the world is ending, let's rape the women one. While this story doesn't lean too heavily into it, it is there. In all, perhaps this is not the most enthralling apocalypse story I've read, but the writing is nicely lyrical and it evokes emotion without being too manipulative or relying too hard on those overused plot devices. It's a perfectly decent read, and I gave it 3 stars. In all, my January wrapped up to be a pretty good month of reads with everything 3 stars or above. I hope your reading year also started out on the right foot. That's all from me today. I hope you read well.